Alright, first in a series of videos. Yeah, right. And this one I'm probably going to mistitle, the beginning, because it probably won't be restricted to the beginning. But it's this whole idea of describing the reality that we exist in, and highlighting the important facts, the ones that are the most significant. And recognizing what this is, what the implication of all this crap is in terms of understanding what we're doing with this thing we're doing, this being alive and having an interaction with the world or the universe for a little period of time, and then rinse and repeat and all of that. And yeah, so understanding that final story, the story that doesn't look like it's going anywhere else. That's all you kind of do is live for the sake of living, and why this is happening. Why? And the why is sort of gets into all this, just the mechanics of making machines, and so this is the context of. Well, it's a description of the truth of how we got here and how we didn't get here, probably more important. So certainly later, in discussing the more complex things that, like the evolving of our intelligence and knowledge, it'd probably be appropriate to get into a conversation about all the reasons, all the logic that indicates that there would be no God, in the sense that this idea of a God doesn't make any sense. It existed forever. It has a mechanical function. It thinks, apparently. It changes its mind. It decides to do something. It does nothing forever, or does this, or twiddles its thumbs, or whatever it does forever, and then one day it says, I'm going to start making living things, and blah, 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 blah. I'll create a whole universe for that purpose, because there wasn't one before then. And it's a silly explanation for the origins of the universe, because first off, it just doesn't answer the question. You don't explain how something got here by saying the something maker did it, and then you have to explain how the something maker got made. And so you didn't answer the question, because now you're still stuck with some stupid concept of a forever thing that's very sophisticated and complicated, and it came from nothing. And so I'm saying, if you just keep the slate clean, just forget about all the fables and the dragons and the nonsense, and you look with our science at the universe, you see it's just these chemicals, balls of chemicals, and that they're manipulated through forces that heat them and stir them up and fuck them up, but they're just chemicals. And as we can see on Earth, obviously the chemistry is a little bit different. So we know that chemistry can acquire a complexity. So as you can burn a compound, you can mix different elements together, and you can create bigger and bigger kind of complex molecules. And then we can surmise on planet Earth what happened is one of those chemicals ended up being something that you could agitate, and it would break in half, and that you'd have two of the chemicals, and that they would reform into the original chemical. That the two halves were capable, kind of forced a reconstruction. And so evolution begins, in a sense, a type of. So you could argue, I would argue, that the first chemistry created a replication by force. So if you hit it with something, you broke it, the pieces, like pulling a lizard's tail off or something, it would grow a new tail. It's not quite, obviously not exactly the same, but the idea is the imperfection would be filled. Kind of like jabbing a bubble of water or something, and it'll bounce around for a while, but then it'll retain its equilibrium. and the equilibrium of the chemistry would be regained, and now you would have more matter captured in these pieces of chemistry. So sort of understand it as a game of capturing matter instead of well, there's different ways to think about it, but I'm just saying, instead of thinking about, just think about it in terms of the final consequence of having one chemical that splits, that breaks, and then it recombines, is that now there's twice as much matter, because it's taken new chemistry and applied it to this form. So now this molecule occupies more of the material universe, so to speak. And if you smash those two, it's even more, and if you smash them, even more. And so it's a kind of consumption of the matter, in the sense that the matter becomes in that arrangement. It's possessed by the molecule, the compound. And that's sort of what life does. So you can surmise the steps that would end up creating a more deliberate mechanism, where you create a cell and the cell contains the chemical, and now the chemistry can break the molecule at any time. Mechanisms internal, captured mechanisms. So everything's just a capture of a mechanism. And so now it doesn't require a wave to hit a rock for the cell to be, for the molecule to be split. And instead there's an internal piece of chemistry that bounces around or floats around inside of a cellular membrane, and then periodically, every 5 hours or something, it would hit the DNA molecule and rip it in half. And because of the configuration of the membrane over time, it would block out nothing. It would certainly allow the chemistry that would rebuild the molecule would be likely to be filtered by the membrane, blah blah blah. And you have a cell now that can just reproduce without being smashed against a rock, and the only factor that would matter would be, has it consumed enough bits to complete the two new molecules. And so yeah, obviously there's a lot of steps, a million steps maybe, and they're all interesting pieces of science and chemistry, but I don't think there's anything significant in terms of relevance to our lives beyond understanding that it's just a mechanical process that, once initiated, the mechanisms that consume the most matter, that is the molecules that grab chemicals from the environment and possess them, whoever does it first and fastest wins in the early evolution. And there's speculation about the first life forms on Earth, and the fact that we're fundamentally a second generation life form, in the sense that the first life forms ended up getting eaten by their own children in the sense that they created such a filthy and dirty world, all the residue left over, the bits toxic to the chemical, that it was all just waste. And so then it became the waste eaters that would inherit the earth, in the first version of creation, and the poo eaters, and they thrive, and the new model is born. And then you go through these different transitions of having dominant and recessive genes, and sexual reproduction, and how these all just accelerate the process of trial and error, the idea of modifying through errors. So it's just bad copies. You make a copy that's not a perfect copy. Imperfections in the copy is the fundamental mechanism of evolution. So it's really just error code, and every now and then you make a mistake that's really quite brilliant. You could be painting a car and accidentally, make the paint go off to the side or something, and it ends up painting the tail of the cat or something, and it's just perfect. Put a little white tip on the tail of the cat. It's marvelous. brilliant, something like that. Happy accidents, and so happy in the sense that the error model is actually an improvement, and that's the fundamental mechanism of the process of evolution. And this is our origin. Now, if you disagree with that basic description, that's what took place on Earth, now you can say that, well, it landed here from another planet, or a god made it, but there's no evidence for that, and I don't think it's a relevant part of the story. So I'm saying that if you had to start from a neutral point, you're just keep our scientific knowledge, no knowledge of gods, no knowledge of even thinking about UFOs on purpose. Not that you can't imagine them, but you don't bother thinking about it, because what would be the relevance of it when you have no evidence of it? First, you're just trying to figure out how the process works. But again, you can always make these arguments where I can say, just as I can point out that God doesn't explain creation because you have to explain who created the God or what created the God, because it's very complicated, and yet it just poofed. That doesn't make much sense. And the same argument for the aliens. The aliens, if they existed, how did they become existing? They didn't just poof either. So this evolution thing has to happen regardless. They had to go through some similar process of chemistry combining and creating a mechanism that would create a fully formed organism. Now, it could be a blob, like it could be a single cell, but you'd have a hard time describing how the single cell could ever evolve very, very complex function, in the sense that there's not much of a structure for that that would permit that. But regardless, yes, it's possible, but again, so yes, you can have variations on what level some sort of complex function in terms of the advantage of having of being able to behave intelligently or with senses, and to have a record of what your senses perceive. So this is another one, like a key fact. So in this story that eventually will be told better, there's these just key facts, and it's a key fact that obviously being able to sense the environment, record what's happening, perceive what's happening, and then also have a record of what has happened, and be able to compare present circumstances to past circumstances would be incredibly valuable as a mechanism in making an organism more competitive, and making it more capable of dealing with the environment. I mean, so this is just one of those core facts, that intelligence, if we want to call it that, some intelligence, let's just say, some ability to live both in the past and the present, would be hugely valuable in terms of anticipating what's going to happen and being able to deal with it. Knowing your limitations, Clint Eastwood line, hugely important. Knowing where you fail, knowing you can't fly, knowing knowing all the stuff you learn through experience, just incalculably valuable in terms of making you capable of outcompeting the other molecules, the other competitors, like or unlike. Yeah, I smoked myself a pack of cigarettes. Lovely. Yeah, I missed them so. Anyway, so there's lots of these key things. I've gone over them before, but another key thing in understanding what's happening to us in terms of this whole big picture of evolution and finding the key components in it would be understanding that we've essentially gone through phases, and where you hit a plateau, a platform, and then you rebuild a new building on top of the platform. So it's like you build, and then you build, and then you build. And the first building was this cellular life form. You know, the cell with a bunch of mitochondria, other little energy things, so it can create the chemistry and the timing mechanisms, if you want to call it that, the survival mechanisms, the defense mechanisms, all the little hardware of a cell, and that's what we call that a living thing. And the cell can divide its nucleus, and then the cell itself will separate, and it will have not only a genetic component, but it has a physical component that travels with it. So the genetic component tells it what the timing cycle would be and the mechanism of cellular division, and the membrane component is a piece of hardware that's likely to stay. It's a lot harder to evolve that piece of hardware. So there are parts of us that have to stay crude. So it's like the epigenetic component of your cells is really the hardware of the egg. There's a whole bunch of those pieces that are very primitive because there's no way for them to be genetically evolved because they're before the chromosomes are read, kind of a thing. But anyway, that's a kind of a complex argument. So anyway, you have this single cell, and we know that single cells have a certain capacity to gain a certain complexity. So we could say like a paramecium would be the apex, or the top of the ladder. There's probably other organisms, single cell organisms, where they're more complex. So I don't, I'm just using any one of these little things that squiggles about in a fluid, and that's the best it's going to get. And in the 4 billion years of its evolution, it's it barely gets a mouth, it barely gets an anus, it does a minor amount of organs, if you can call them that. A little squiggling tail, little bits of hardware. The real, what is relevant to what we consider a life form is the fact that these cells become organized. So first in things like sponges and even jellyfish or something, things that have a certain capacity to, it's just a loose association between the cells. They're not tightly bonded. They're like little colonies of different kinds of cells that are kind of loosely held together and called a thing, a living thing. And but it's all tied in the sense that the one genetic code kind of holds it all together. And you can almost see like an ant colony as a rudimentary form of that on the higher level. So it's certainly a higher plane organism, but it's almost creating a same kind of mechanism in the sense that the individuals are all not working for their own genetic code. They're working for the queen's genetic code, and so it's creating a bunch of cells of like kind. They reproduce like each other, and then they end up being essentially a slave to a colony. Then it's the colony, it's one DNA molecule that's the master, and that master DNA essentially tells the rest of the colonies what they're going to do. Alright, well anyway, so we get the idea of a colony life form, and that's what we are the apex of, so to speak, taken to its most complex level. In terms of something you could say a general class of organism like mammal, but there's certainly a huge complexity even in insects. In terms of the hardware and the mechanics, they're just not as developed intellectually, but they have certainly a lot of physical attributes that are highly sophisticated and well honed over time to be very efficient at the function. But you have a bunch of cells essentially captured. They don't know they're human, they're just doing they're living in the ocean that is the vessel, and they're essentially just captured colony, and they're regulated in terms of how much they can grow and how much they divide, and all the things they do is sort of controlled by all the other cells in the colony, and by the chemistry that's controlled in the colony, and it's, this happens over millions and billions of years, so obviously there's lots of refining, and it becomes a very highly regulated, highly tuned system of function, and it's, just incredibly complex. Just your finger, any piece of your body's got all kinds of networks and roadways and all kinds of specialized cells doing specialized things, but all interrelated and all highly regulated, but all essentially slaves to the reproductive cells. So those are the only cells that matter, and the rest of this is just a mechanism for replicating successfully, for possessing matter in the form that is something like my genetic code. That's what all these organisms are doing, is just collecting matter, and whoever collects the most matter wins, kind of a thing. But that's where the system gets a little bit more nuanced, is that over time it's learned that being too successful will get you killed. And so many of the most successful organisms ended up dying because they ended up overpopulating and essentially becoming poisonous to each other. Their evolution would fail to produce an organism that could survive in the bleak world they created. It would be essentially like us living in our own shit. We're not likely to thrive in such an environment. Living in waste is not going to be conducive to your survival. And so organisms obviously had to have some built-in mechanism so that when times were good, they didn't go too far and become too successful and all of that kind of thing and end up wallowing in their own waste. So that's why we die at a certain rate, and that's why there's all kinds of mechanisms to protect against overpopulation. And so most species won't overpopulate, but we know that the strongest force against that is the fact that there's always a bunch of predation from the external environment. The other competitors are likely to solve that problem for you. They're likely to make it difficult for you to thrive. I've used in the past examples, but I think things very highly successful mechanisms like funguses are very old, and you could argue, why don't they grow everywhere? Why aren't they covering every surface? Because they technically could. And I think the answer is that they did that. They've been there and done that and failed, and that the real strategy is not to be too successful, because then you become food. Then you begin some other organism becoming completely devoted to eating and exploiting, and that's not a good idea. Looking like food is not a good idea. So if you can avoid being so populous that another species can survive parasiting you, then you're better off hiding, not being too successful, spreading yourself thin, something like that. Don't allow another organism to become dependent because they are exclusive. Because if you feed them entirely, then when you don't have food, they'll eat your house, so to speak. So anyway, these are all parts of this thing. So anyway, so that this is really an important understanding, though, is that the first stage of life is the cell. We're made of cells, but we function entirely different. It's a slave master. There's a whole different kind of game than the game pieces, so to speak. I mean, so that's why it's very important to understand that it's just a completely different kind of organism. A colony is completely different than an individual, just like one human, and then there's a group of humans. I mean, those are two different mechanisms, and so I think people underappreciate that distinction. Clearly they underappreciate it in the sense they call both organisms a living thing, the cell, the brick, and the building. So it'd be like you calling buildings bricks. And that would be kind of confusing, wouldn't it? Yeah, it would be. So it's not so clear our language hasn't even kept up with the reality that there's a huge function difference. All right, well, anyway, and then the point is really is that the third plateau is the creation of the central nervous system, the neuron, and the capacity to use a neuron, not just to create very quick communication between one end of a body and another, and that's what it originally, that's why neurons exist, is because they were electrical, and that means the electrical signal could travel much faster than a chemical signal. And but then that neuron had this incidental, just like the first, just like cells turning into colonies, another incidental effect was that neurons could be connected together and create a logic tool, and on-off switches that regulated each other. So two of them had to be on for the third one to go to be on. You know, so I don't want to go into a whole explanation of logic circuits, but that's what it is. And logic circuits are the foundation of a computer or a device for storing information. And so that's what neurons started doing, was only turning on when certain circumstances existed. And so they would, to do that, they had to sense the circumstances. So the neurons started becoming the sense organs, and the sense organs became tied to each other and regulated each other. And in the end, you get this complex brain. And once you have a brain, it's basically a very functional device. Now, outside of our, what I would argue is this problem of our subjective and native conditioning, which blinds us much to much of the value of our intelligence. I mean, I've made this argument so many times, but the original purpose was a scheming tool. Intelligence was just used for this organism to scheme its success in the environment. But clearly, as we gain more and more knowledge, we're able to elevate perception with this scheming tool. The scheming tool becomes a tool capable of seeing more than just feeling the senses. So it's more than just what I see. I can see the past and I can imagine the future. So my brain can now create knowledge, and it can see myself as just a player in the game. And so I'm no longer obsessed with what I get out of it. I'm more obsessed with understanding a total game and how the game itself is played. And in doing that, in gaining a third-person perspective and a bird's-eye view of yourself, you can understand all kinds of the mechanisms of your psychology, understand your nepotism, the cheats that exist, the ill logic of some of your behavior, and you can understand that there's a bigger game being played among equals rather than a game that's just about me. And that's all part of what I would call is the evolution of intelligence or knowledge. So you have these three fundamental phases of evolution: the cell's evolution, the evolution of the colony organism, and then ultimately the evolution of memes or ideas, or a knowledge base that contains a whole bunch of listed truths about your reality. So part of what this video is a demonstration of that mechanism, of our ability to sit there and list the truth about what it is to be here, be alive, and the world we're in, and the game we're playing, and what's of value, and what's reasonable in the context of those known facts, what's considered evidence, and what's can be coherently fit into these puzzle. And that's what it is. We're in describing reality or discovering it. It's like a detective or something, but it's like just putting puzzle pieces together. You got to make them fit, and that's what we're in the process of doing. Is refining our language, making it precise enough that the pieces fit, and to just in a sense accurately describe what we're doing here, what the function is, what's happening. So the basic argument that the beginning is the only beginning that's relevant. Okay, now I'm finally getting to the real gist of the first fact, and the number one fact is that it really doesn't matter what created the universe. It doesn't matter how old the universe is. We know what the function of the biological mechanism is, in the sense that we know that it's chemistry. We know the chemistry replicates, and we know that once the replication is written on a piece of DNA, that this process of evolution, this process of writing incorrect copies and doing it a lot of times will create change. The shape of organisms will change based on that mechanism. And certainly this is the arguments about determinism and the inevitability of this whole flowing of this river over the waterfall is clearly a philosophical subject worth having, or conversation, or a fact worth recognizing. But in a sense, it's a fact so unrelated to just acknowledging that this is the mechanism. The fact that every bit of water, water in a cloud right now has an inevitable, lifespan. It's going to fall. It's going to land in a stream somewhere. It's going to flow down a river. It's going to end up in the ocean. It's going to end up getting warm again. It's going to end up going back into a cloud. We know all that's determined. I mean, there's nothing special happening here. It's all just going to move based on physics. Little bits pushing it, forces pushing it. It has no will of its own, and it has no capacity to step beyond or to fly out of that reality. But like I said, that's not really an important subject in terms of recognizing the beginning is really the subject of evolution. That's the beginning. It's the beginning for any other alien species. It's the beginning for us. It's the beginning for any notion of intelligence and its creation. This is how intelligence gets created. It's created because organisms need weapons to compete in a gladiator war once they're in an environment with a bunch of changing organisms. They have to compete with the change, and they have to successfully survive the change, the other new models. They have to prove themselves better. And that's the system that has percolated us, has precipitated us, that we're just a byproduct of, is this long test of DNA code, and certainly the circumstances of being lucky and unlucky and all of that stuff could be written into your ancestry, and you could certainly say that maybe my code wasn't the best code, but it just happened that my people were out of town when the plague showed up, some kind of bullshit like that. So it's not necessarily about any kind of argument of fitness. It's an argument of fitness over time, in the sense that you had to get lucky a lot. Yeah, maybe that's it. Certainly that's a component of success, I guess, is the only argument. It's not a pure test of proficiency, but just as the Olympics isn't a very good test of the best athlete, in the sense that it's the best athlete on the day that it takes place, and if you redo the event maybe over a period of 10 days, maybe you'll end up with a different winner. But anyway, to take some of the luck out of it anyway. The luck of the day. Because anybody can wake up with a headache. But anyway, So, so I could get into the whole other parts of evolution, but I mean, I guess what I want just to stress is that it just all begins with the subject of evolution, making tools that make organisms capable of surviving. One of the tools is this sense organ thing that can do this data processing, and there's really no point in us doing inaccurate data processing, so it's a pretty functional remembering device or rendering device. It renders the external world fairly coherently, accurately, because inaccurate wouldn't be of any value. Wouldn't make much sense for a wolf running through a woods to put the trees in its head in the wrong place. I mean, it needs to know where the trees are in reality, not where they are, and not where he wishes they were. He has to run through the real trees, and we have to function in a real world, and our brain is very good at rendering the world. Now, the problem is, like I said, is that we're conditioned to be survivors and gladiators, so there's some of the agenda built into the device is a perception of value. The fact that we love our own children, or love our parents, or love this whole stuff like nepotism can be understood as not being logical perceptions of the world, that those feelings and emotions aren't intended to give us the truth. They're intended to give us information valuable to perpetuating our selfish gene, not our smart knowledge. So those things are anti-intelligent in the sense that those are things we sense or feel for the primitive purpose. That's the crude agenda, and our smarter intelligence can know that that's a crude agenda. Just as we can kind of realize that our superficial tastes, like in terms of loving women or something, you can see that you're being kind of superficial. She has to have the right eyes, or the right color hair, or the right build, and it's all this superficial crap that's somehow important, and you can kind of look at that quite obviously and say, gee, that seems pretty superficial. I'd like to value a life mate for better function than that trivial function. But that's the mechanism, because those are in the old game we were playing as dumb animals. Those are the things that worked in terms of making you capable of successfully killing your neighbors, and the other tribes, the other versions of yourself, the other versions of humankind that were out to get you, essentially. And that's the game we're stuck in. So anyway, so again, the emphasis being that the facts are, clearly point to this being the key thing is this idea of replication. It's a replicating molecule, and that once it starts evolving, that it's just going to do this attrition game. Like I said, who does it more efficiently wins and gets to the future. And over a number of millions of years, you end up with creatures not unlike ourselves. And now what do you do with it? It will be the next phases in this description of reality. So that's probably, I don't want to, there's just so many little pieces of, ways of looking at things. And again, it's understanding how we possess, the matter, and that's part of like the function, is just holding on to matter. If you hold it, then somebody else can't take it or use it. And so it's like the organisms that were successful kind of had to just capitalize on keeping the matter away from the other organisms so they can't hold it. It's just kind of a little greed war. But there's so many ways to look at that, or metaphor it, or analogize it, or tell the story. But the story just doesn't have any good stuff in it. There's no leprechauns and spirit gods and blah 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 blah. It's a bleak, horrid, crude, nasty origin. Lots of dead babies. Yeah, all over the place. So anyway, so yeah, volume 1. Continuing. But yeah, I mean, somewhere in this I will attempt to condense these key facts, key words, and attempt to find arguments against where somewhere there's a flaw in this reasoning. So I don't think there were any flaws in reasoning in what has been stated so far. And beyond people's hallucinations. Yeah. Until next time.